thank you for joining us on Charting the Way Forward, where we deliver research-informed strategy and intelligence from across the Democratic coalition. This podcast is produced by Way to Win. I'm your host, Kerry Eleveld, and today I am joined by...
I'm Tory Gavito. I'm one of the co-founders and president of Way to Win.
Okay, and today we have a real treat. We have Ron Brownstein, a longtime journalist and analyst, and frankly, one of my personal heroes for his ability to dissect what's happening in an electorate and in an election, truly. He cut his political chops at the National Journal and the Los Angeles Times, followed by the Atlantic, and now writes regular columns for CNN and Bloomberg. So welcome in, Ron.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Glad to be with you.
Yeah.
No, this really is a bucket list. I was telling Ron in the green room earlier, as a Texan who has followed his Sunbelt work for a minute, this is bucket list time. So thank you.
The first time I was in Texas was the 86 governor's race, actually.
Wow.
And I was there for both of the Ann Richards races, the Clady Williams and the George W. Bush race, of course, which she famously called Shrub. But, at that point, they still had the law that nothing in Austin could be higher than the state capitol.
I remember that.
And I think I was staying in a DoubleTree that was 12 stories, which was that was the big building in Austin.
I know that hotel.
It was a horizontal city. Now it's pretty damn vertical, man.
I know. It's pretty damn vertical.
What did Judy Collins say? Something's gained, but something's lost. It's that's kind of the way it goes.
We lost
But I digress.
We lost Leslie, who was the town fixture. They would run around town in the most phenomenal garb, and we gained Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Wow. That's a rough go. All right. Well, as you can tell, we could have Ron talk about basically anything political, and we would all walk away smarter people for it. But we reached out specifically about CNN piece he recently penned titled, "It's Time to Redefine the Swing Voter." And to be candid, at Way to Win, we've spent a lot of time studying a certain segment of these voters, as many of our listeners know, the Biden skippers. But Ron, your article really drove home why these voters are so critical in the emerging 21st century electorate. So I wanted to start by giving you a chance to tell us about these new swing voters and how they sort of differ from traditional swing voters.
Well, like I said, I've been covering politics for a while, since the 1980s. The 84 election was the first one I covered. And back in the day when no building could be higher than 12 stories in Austin, the definition of a swing voter that was dominant in both parties was the idea of someone who regularly voted election after election, but switched who they voted for on a regular basis. They might vote for a presidential candidate of one party, a congressional or Senate candidate of another party, or they might just vote Republican in 84 and Democratic in 88. I mean, that was kind of the vision of the swing voter. And certainly that was the vision in the 90s, I think. But really starting in the early 21st century, I think the kind of paradigm shifted in the parties, where their vision of a swing voter was not only the people who switch back and forth, of whom there are relatively few. I mean, the conventional definition of the swing voter, the person who went back and forth, there are just a lot less of them than there were 40, 50 years ago. And so I think the parties have increasingly focused, and this has really been underscored both in the Obama and the Trump years, that there's a different kind of swing voter. And those are the people who cycle in and out of the electorate, completely who vote or not. And voting or not is in many ways the reflection of the same kind of shifting allegiance, maybe a halfway house on the kind of continuum that we see among people who switch or not. And, so I mean, when Catalyst, looked at I asked the folks at Catalyst, who are kind of the premier data crunchers on the Democratic side, but respected on both sides, how many people voted in both 20 and 24? And how many of them probably switched? I mean, and they concluded that somewhere around 125 million people voted in both elections, and maybe somewhere between 6 million at the low end, 10 to 12 million at the high end of them voted for someone different in 24 than they did in 20. And that includes, by the way, people who voted for a third party and moved to one of the major candidates. But that's dwarfed by the number of people who cycled in and out of the electorate, who either didn't vote after voting 4 years before, or did vote after not voting 4 years before. That's about 60 million people. So potentially you're talking about somewhere between 6 to 10 times as many people cycle in and out of the electorate in every presidential year as switch their votes between the parties over a 2-election sequence. And that is just kind of a different way of looking at the world. I will point out that this really has a lot of impact in the midterms as well. Again, using Catalyst data, about 50 million people who voted for Obama in 08 didn't vote, who voted in 08 didn't vote in 2010. And about 50 million people who voted in 2012 didn't vote in 2014. Most of those drop-off voters were clearly Obama voters. And while there was vote switching in those elections, again, it was the withdrawal of those people, the making the choice not to vote, that really contributed to the Democratic difficulties in the 2010 and 2014 midterms. And it is Trump who is now in that position, I think, in many ways, for 2026. So we can talk about that further. But who votes is clearly now, at least, and probably even more important than who switches their vote.
Right.
Why do you think it's taken us this long to catch up with this concept?
Because it seems like every cycle there's a lot of hair pulling and things like, obsession over the swing voters, and particularly white suburban swing voters and whatever. I mean, obviously, they're going to show up. So that's one thing. But anyway.
Well, first of all, as you know, a swing voter is worth double what a voter in and out of the electorate is worth. If you get someone to switch, you're subtracting a vote from one side and adding it to your side, as opposed to bringing in somebody new, you get one vote. Or if you kind of discourage someone from voting with your messaging or more nefarious ways of, voter suppression type things, you gain one vote. So you don't need as many, each swing voter, I guess, is worth 2 cycled voters, if we're going to call them that. That's one thing, but I think it's just kind of residual. I mean, that's kind of the way we were all brought up to think about swing voters. As I said, through 2000, that was the way parties focused. The turning point really was Bush in 04, when Karl Rove, who I met in that 86 trip to Austin, Tory, and Matt Dowd and Mark McKinnon, who had been Democratic strategists for Ann Richards, they basically concluded it was more cost effective to focus on a reliable Republican who doesn't vote than it was to try to change the preference of a reliable voter who was not locked down on your side. And, I think the Obama team largely saw that. I mean, largely agreed with that. They did not have articulated as explicitly, but they put a lot of effort into turning out core Democratic constituencies. Trump in 2016 was a double down strategy on turning out non-college whites. But by 24, Trump was kind of back in his own way into a 90s kind of mindset, where they put a lot of focus on less reliable and irregular voters. No, actually, wait, that's the 2004 mindset. Like Trump, I'm sorry. That is the 2004 mindset where there, what Trump showed in 2016 was that he could turn out non-college whites who don't regularly vote. What he showed in 2024 was that he could turn out non-college non-whites who don't regularly vote. And that was a huge success for him. But it also kind of leaves him on the same hook that Obama was on. Obama turned out a lot of new and irregular voters, especially in 08, to a lesser extent in 12. And then 50 million people who voted in 08 didn't show up in 10. Most of them, by all estimates, Obama voters. And now Trump, has diversified the Republican coalition. I mean, whites comprise less a share of his total vote in 24 than in 20 or 16, but he's also made the Republican coalition more exposed to voters who don't reliably turn out in midterm elections, and who may be at particular risk this time because his approval rating among them is now running so much lower than his vote among them a year ago.
This seems to be getting supercharged every cycle, right? I mean, to some extent, it seems like, I mean, based on the fact that as the number of people who actually vote has gone up and surged in 2020 specifically, and dropped off a little bit in 2024, but not crazy.
Yeah.
That then there's more of those voters. For instance, I went back and there was this New York Times op-ed that ran about in 2016. Well, actually it ran in 2018, but it was related to the 2016 election. It was called The Missing Obama Millions. Mm-hmm. And they were talking about people who voted for Obama in 2012, then skipped 2016. And they estimated that at roughly 4 million plus voters, whereas Catalyst estimates the Biden skippers who voted in 2020 but skipped 2024 at 15 million.
Yes.
So that's it. Like here's this op-ed running about the missing Obama millions in 2020. I mean, in 2016, but there's a sizable bigger chunk of missing Biden voters.
Yeah. Now, here's the thing where I may differ from your perspective, and we should talk about it. If you look at who switched from Biden to Trump, and if you looked at who stayed home from 20 to 24, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, and here I'm relying on Pew validated voters, right? So,
and you mean a lot of overlap from like a demographic perspective?
From a demographic standpoint. So like Pew validated voters found
if you're going to use Pew, but no, I'm just kidding.
Well, the validated voters, people like the validated voters. Right?
I'm joking.
So the validated voters, first of all, the validated voters basically underscore the first point we're talking about. Like somewhere between, I think it was 6 to 9% of Biden 2020 voters who were Black, Latino, or Asian American flipped to voting for Trump, according to Pew in 24, right? Mm-hmm. So pretty modest number, like less than, at the most, 9%. The share of Biden 2020 Black voters who didn't come out again in 24, didn't vote for anybody, was, I think, 19%. For Hispanic voters, it was 23, and for Asian voters, it was 23, which again underscores the point that the people staying home were a much bigger group than the people who switched. The question I have is, given the demographic overlap between the people who switched and the people who stayed home, can Democrats feel confident that if those Biden 2020 voters came out, they still would have voted for Harris? And in the same numbers that they did in 2020? I think the answer is probably not. I mean, I think, I think staying home, as I said before, was kind of a way station on the continuum of discontent. They may not have been ready to vote entirely for Trump, but the fact that they stayed home wasn't simply a factor of them not being reached. It was that they were also disappointed in what they got out of the 4 years of the Biden.
Yeah, no, we agree with that. Like, but and I know
we have actual polling on this, though. I just want to say that. Yeah,
can I just set up our theory, and then Kerry can back me up with some of the data. But it's like we agree that the same slippery slope of bad vibes, misinformation, I don't know, whatever you want to say, backlash to movements, definitely backlash to Biden's economic agenda, this sort of thing, or the not feeling of an economic recovery. That same slippery slope is what all those voters, like that was the slide they were all on.
Yeah.
It's just there's a group of them who are not MAGA curious. Like our data will say, yeah, we weren't into Harris, and they can tell you why, but they are not going to vote for Trump either. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that in a hypothetical, if there was some kind of forced turnout where all those people who stayed home versus like falling off the slide and into a MAGA vote would have voted MAGA, it doesn't seem resonant with the data we have, where they're very
I agree with that.
They're clearly anti-Trump. Like they will name, he doesn't stand for me, he doesn't stand for my values. Some are willing to say, like, we can see his racism. Others will say, some of the research that we've been following from our peers at Equis and our own data will show that Latinos specifically will say things like, Yeah. We know he's racist, but he's a good businessman. He'll be good on the economy. And that's where he's got a weakness right now. To your point about now he's on the same hook that Obama was after the big turnout experiment. He's got some serious weaknesses where people are not buying it. They know suddenly they're like, oh, maybe he was just a reality TV star and not a businessman. So there's some openings.
Yeah, I guess obviously we don't know, it's counterfactual. My guess is that if we look at the 23% of Biden 2020 Hispanic voters who did not show up in 24, according to Pew, that's a huge number. I mean, basically 1/4 of his Hispanic voters did not come back. And I think another 9% of them switched. I'm guessing if all of that 23% had voted, Harris would have won most of them, but not by nearly as big a margin as they did. That's earlier when it was 100%.
That's almost exactly. It's almost exactly what our data says, to be honest. So we did a national poll of Biden skippers, and they said forced to choose who they would vote for if they had turned out. 56% said Biden. This isn't Latinos. This is everyone. 56% said Biden. A quarter said Trump, and the rest were like third party.
Harris.
So Biden. Sorry, Harris. Right, Harris. My bad.
Right.
Harris.
Yeah. No, and that seems totally plausible to me. I mean, that does. If you're trying to look forward, you got to try to understand what was happening looking back. And your point, Tory, is really important, which is that, like, my view on these, and I think there are Republicans who agree with it, very much agree with this, like Patrick Ruffini very much agrees with this, that the irregular voters are much more conditions voters than ideological voters. Like the idea that they were, that the irregular Hispanic voters who moved toward Trump were all basically endorsing, they were there because they didn't like that Harris was for they, them, as opposed to they didn't think the Biden presidency delivered for them. I mean, they are results vote. Like one thing that 24 challenged me on was in this post-Rove, post-Axelrod Pluff, post-04 world. I have largely internalized the idea that there aren't that many swing voters anymore. And in fact, there aren't that many swing voters in the sense that we're talking about them, right? People who go back and forth. But what 24, and that therefore, if there aren't that many swing voters, it's because everybody is kind of, 92% of the electorate is dug in on one side or the other of this ideological divide. They've picked their team who agrees with them on all the things they care about. I think 24 showed us, like 20, that when you start getting up to a bigger electorate, when you start getting up to 155 or 160 million people voting, you are bringing in more people who are not fully sorted out in that ideological conflict and are basically voting about how things are going. I like to say they may not, these additional surge voters may not be people who closely follow all the news and can tell you where Republicans and Democrats are on every issue, but they are experts in their own lives.
Yeah.
Right. And they were making a judgment in 24 that things just weren't as good as they were hoping. Maybe it was inflation, maybe it was the border, probably mostly inflation. And it wasn't like they had necessarily bought the whole thing. They thought, like, and I'm sure you guys, I talked to Jennifer. I mean, your focus groups had the same thing as everybody else. You do a focus group with Black or Hispanic men, and they would say, yeah, he's a cretin, he's a racist, he disrespects women. But if I'm being honest, I had more money in my pocket at the end of the week when he was president. Right? That's what people said everywhere. And now here we are, and people are not feeling they have more money in their pocket when he's president. And not only that, they're getting a version of ICE enforcement that I think they had to willfully convince themselves was not coming, but nonetheless did convince themselves was not coming. And after the Supreme Court decision the other day, they're going to get more of it. There are going to be more people with their faces slammed into sidewalks around America, and most of them are going to be Latino. So, there's no reason to assume that all of the casual voters who broke for him in 24 are either going to come out in 26 or stick with him if they do.
And to your point too, I'm remembering that, and I think these were your numbers or the numbers that you quoted. A quarter of Latinos who voted for Trump also opposed mass deportation.
Yeah.
So those people are now getting something they opposed, but not getting the benefit that they voted for, or they thought they were voting for.
Wasn't in that story, but using the AP Vocast, I calculated that Trump won a higher share of pro-choice women in 24 than he did in 20. Like that was after Dobbs than before Dobbs. I mean, there were a lot of voters. I mean, I remember talking to one consultant who was saying that they were doing focus groups among blue collar white women in the Rust Belt, which is like, you know, do people do any other focus groups? And
we do.
Okay. So, and they were talking about all the things Trump might do that they don't like, you know, restrict abortion access or restrict access to mifepristone or encourage just more incivility. You know, I mean, we've talked about this before. You know, among women, even among women who vote for Trump, many of them say they don't like the tone he sets. They don't like their kids watching it, and you know, they don't like the idea of behaving this way. But you know, you'd bring this up, and women who were planning to vote for Trump would actively push it away, saying, "I don't believe it. It's not going to happen," because they were so convinced that their life was unaffordable and it was going to remain unaffordable if Harris won, and they did not want the cognitive dissonance of having to vote for this guy who they thought would improve their bottom line, but also might do these other things that they really didn't want to have happen. And, you know, I mean, that may be less true among Latino voters. You know, there does seem like the share of Latinos who express conservative views was always higher than the share who were willing to vote for Republicans. And I'm not sure you can put that genie back in the bottle entirely. But part of Trump's gain was not that. It was people who were just unhappy that they couldn't afford their grocery bill. And I think he is not, polling is pretty clear that they don't think he is delivering on that. And they're giving him something they didn't want, which is this very aggressive ICE enforcement that somehow, that I think they had to do double backflips to convince themselves wasn't coming. But nonetheless, they did those double backflips and convinced themselves it wasn't coming.
Right. So one thing I do just want to note is that this is, I mean, one thing that really resonated with me was a quote you included from, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Dan Cannon. Yeah, Cannon, who was the battleground state director for both Biden and Harris. But he said every modern campaign has to think about it this way. Turnout is persuasion. And this is something that we have been talking about and putting in, you know, our messaging and, you know, our memos and whatever, is that, you know, it's just, if there's no GOTV anymore, you just have, I mean, yes, there is, but like, you have to persuade people to go to the polls. You must persuade them because they may not just turn out.
Whether you call it a continuum as I do, or the slippery slope, which is an even better metaphor, as Tory did. Yeah, I mean, essentially, people are I think the fact that 23% of Biden's 2020 Latino voters did not vote in 24 was not just a reflection of not enough people called them or knocked on their door, right? I mean, it wasn't just a mechanical failure to contact them because everybody gets contacted now. It was that they made a judgment that it wasn't worth going out to vote because they were not satisfied with what they got, and they weren't convinced that what they were going to get would be different enough. So his point, you're not just, if we think of GOTV as mechanically sending somebody to the door to knock or texting them, that doesn't seem to adequately capture what goes into the decision of these 60 million people who are cycling in and out of the electorate, between the number of new voters and the number of, you know, people who stay home. Like, you know, Harris in 24 got hit on both sides of the swinging door. The people who voted in 20 and stayed home in 24 were mostly Biden voters. And the people who voted in 24 but didn't vote in 20 were mostly Trump voters. So they lost both ends. They lost the drop-off voters, hurt them, and the new voters hurt them. So it kind of gives you a sense. In fact, it is persuasion all the time on both fronts.
Can I give you another term that one day you should interrogate for us to retire, is the low information voter. Like, we've been talking about it for a minute, but as long as I've been in politics, there has been the, you know, we in campaigns get the voter file data, and voters are put on a continuum. Are you more or less likely to vote? And are you more or less likely to be Republican or Democrat? And we pick sweet spots of where we think we need to run persuasion program or where we need to do turnout programs. And the turnout programs tend to focus on the low information voter, which is maybe they're not reading the news, but they definitely are more of the irregular voters.
Yeah.
And in what I'm tracking from all of our research, listening to these less frequent voters who specifically voted for Biden in 20, but then didn't turn back out in 24, they are the opposite of low information. They are receiving a deluge of information. I mean, I think gone are the days where the information we considered being salient was like, are you reading a newspaper? Or are you watching a cable news source? This is like all of them are getting flooded with information in their palms.
Yeah.
And they're making decisions based around it. So when you said earlier something about
I think they're expert in their own lives.
They're expert in their own lives. Boy, is that like, but they think they're expert in their own lives, like from whether my kids should get vaccinated or whether, you know, like suddenly we're all experts in tariffs, you know, this sort of thing. Anyway, I'm putting that out there for fodder because it does feel like another arena in which a Democratic political operative is maybe playing a little too elite by calling some of these voters low information to our peril.
Yeah.
You know, the other aspect of all of this, obviously, is whether we call them low information, and that is a really good point. And other people have argued that to me. And as I say, I think even if they're not even if people who don't follow the news that closely, they know what's going on in their lives, and they're very capable of voting based on that. But you know, we have this situation where, if in fact we are now, you know, well, actually, it's true of both ends. You know, if one party is stronger with low propensity as opposed to low information voters than high propensity voters, you have a real risk of the midterm sending a false signal on the general, right? So Republicans won in 2010 more seats than either party had won in the House since 1938. And then Obama kind of cruised to re-election 2 years later. I mean, partly he was in a better position, but also the electorate was different, right? And more of that, what were Democratic leaning low propensity voters at that point showed up in 12 than showed up in 10. I believe the original sin of Democrats was not only or solely or even primarily waiting to acknowledge how Biden had been diminished by age. It was taking an unrealistically comforting message from 22. You know, when Democrats did surprisingly well, but in 24, when these lower, less frequent voters, more irregular voters showed up, they were unwilling to do what so many high propensity voters did in 22. Like in 22, you had a lot of voters who were unhappy with the economy and unhappy with Biden who voted for Democrats anyway. They voted for Whitmer, they voted for Shapiro, they voted for Evers, they voted for Kelly, they voted for Warnock. In 24, that was just much less true. Like the lower propensity voters, I think, were not willing to say, well, you guys screwed up the economy, but I'll vote for her anyway because I don't like the other side. I just think so. Like, you got to be careful now, I think, either side about over interpreting a midterm, because the bigger electorate is just, and it's really bigger now. It's like big, 155, 160, adds a lot of complexity, and you can do well in the midterm. I mean, it's always somewhat true, but I think it's even more true now. You can do well in the midterm without telling you a lot about what's going to happen 2 years later.
Okay, but we do have a midterm. We do have a midterm coming up.
Absolutely.
So we should at least let's look forward for a second and get your views. You know, the swing voters, these new swing voters, the infrequent voters, the ones who showed up for Trump but not Harris, were young and non-white mostly. I mean, do you think Republicans are on track to keep with these voters and get them back to the polls next year?
I don't think. I mean, this is obviously this is probably the key question of 26. I mean, I think one big dynamic in 26 is pretty much baked in, which is that the ground Trump regained among college educated voters, he's probably not going to hold. Like, I don't see it. I mean, like in 24, he did better than he did in 20 or 22 or 18. Republicans did in 22 and 18 among those college educated voters, because they were also unhappy with what they got out of Biden. I think if you look at his polling now, I think Democrats, and we're going to see this we'll see this first in Virginia, New Jersey. I think Democrats are going to restore pretty big, Tory, I'd love you to weigh in on this, but I think they're going to restore pretty big advantages among college educated whites. It'll be more like the 18 to 22 period than they were like the 24 period, where Harris slightly underperformed among them as well, particularly the men and even the women. I think she was in the high 50s, not the low 60s, which is what everybody thought she would get to. So I think that, and that matters because college educated whites are usually 3 to 4 points more of the electorate in the midterm than they are in the presidential. That's significant. That was a big factor in 22. What happens? What's the other big dynamic is what happens with Trump's inroads among non-white voters, particularly non-college non-white voters. His approval rating among non-college non-white voters in all the polls I've looked at is under 30% now. Okay, like his approval rating among non-college non-white voters, which is the group where he made the most important gains with in 24, is under 30%. His approval rating among Hispanics is significantly declined. I think that means if we have an election where that looks anything like a normal election, which is not a guarantee, we don't know what the rules are going to be like or what the interference is going to be like. I think that I don't know if Democrats get all the way back to where they were in 2018 and 2020 among Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black voters, but I don't think Trump stays at where he was in 24. I think he will have a differential turnout problem. I think where some of his new voters are just not going to feel that he's delivered enough for them to show up and give him a vote of support. And I think he's going to have if you look at some of the polling that's been done, I mean, there's somewhere between 8 and 10% of Trump 2024 Latino voters who say, I'm sorry I did what I did. So I think he is facing some tough dynamics. Now, what happened in 22 could offer a way for him, though, to minimize the damage. Like in 22, and I'm relying mostly on Mike Podhorser's analysis of Catalyst data.
We like that.
We saw the overall drop off was similar. Like 50 million fewer people voted in 22 than 20. But it was kind of bifurcated. Like in the states that were less heavily contested, Democrats had a big fall off among Democratic voters. In the big battleground states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, not so much. Democrats held their turnout. They held their 2020 voters. So can Trump do that in reverse in 26? I guess we'll find out.
Well, then there's a persuasion question for Democrats, which is, can they get some of the people that they didn't get out in 2024 to the polls in 2026? Yeah,
right? Totally.
And so, one school of thought among Democrats for why that didn't happen in 2024 was that, the woke and lefty groups doomed Harris, right? I'll say our view is that Democrats didn't do enough to engage with them on a populist economic narrative, about why their lives were felt so bad. And in particular, that named villains and heroes, the way Trump actually does something Trump does really well. I mean, do you have a view as to either what Democrats, I'm asking a leading question here, but do you have a view as to what Democrats need to do in order to persuade people to the polls?
So I have a lot of views.
We'll take them.
My general view is that midterm elections are more about the incumbent president than anything else. And the president's approval rating is the most important factor in midterm elections at this point, I think. And so I do think that Democrats need a positive economic message, but I think the principal question of how many people show up, particularly Democratic leaning voters, show up in 26 is going to be how alarmed they are by what Trump is doing. And I think that alarm receded in 24. I mean, you saw his retrospective job approval rating rising to a level that was higher than it ever was when he was actually president. People were no longer focusing on all the things he did they didn't like. They were focusing on the fact they had more money in their pocket, they thought, which they did like. So I actually think that, and you guys may disagree, I think that 26 is going to be mostly about can Democrats raise enough alarm about Trump? Yeah. In 2010, I would just point out that in 2010, in the summer and early fall of 2010 in Gallup polling, the Democratic Party image of the Democrats in general was higher than the Republican Party image. And then they went out and lost 64 seats because it was fundamentally about the voters who came out wanted to send a negative message on Obama and Obamacare. And Democrats were unable to get many of their first time and irregular Obama voters back to match that surge.
But I do think, well, I would just add, I agree with you. I think 2026, the imperative for Democrats is to raise the alarm on Trump. But I think we have to be mindful that the things that freak out the college educated voter,
right,
and the things that freak out the more infrequent voter and the younger voter and the voter of color are different things.
Totally agree.
So like,
right. It's not that the alarm has to be that he's an authoritarian. The alarm for many voters is that he promised to solve your cost of living problems and he didn't. All he did was enrich himself and his rich buddies, right? He's made billions. He gave billions to Elon Musk. And what did you get?
But it's a real I mean, I'll just kind of like, give you a little bit behind the veil here. As a Way to Win was born to be a donor collaborative. So we work with donors, a lot of different donors across the country. We work with other donor outfits that have different points of view and this sort of thing. And I can tell you, part of this challenge is going to have to be for some faction of the donor to get out of the way, because there is a lot of donor that is a little bit fearful about what a populist economic message means. And so, that's why I'm kind of demystifying why there's some debate right now about, like, do we go after pointing to the problems that Democrats have had in governance, which is, kind of the central thrust of some of the abundance books, or do we go after, the fact that Democrats and Republicans have been a part of a multi-decade project that has resulted in an economy that rivals the Gilded Age, right? In terms of who has not. And so,
and don't forget door number 3, which is that Trump is undermining the democracy, right?
Yeah. No, I was block walking. You'll see the kick out of this. I was block walking in Arizona in the weekend before Election Day. And I could tell you right away we were losing. I could tell you right away we were losing. And I knocked on a Latino door. It was I would say he's a 30-something Latino man from Central America. And I got him talking about what worries him the most. And he actually said he was very worried about democracy. He was very worried about the economy, but he was also very worried about democracy. And then I asked him what that meant to him. He meant left-wing people burning, like, in Arizona, they have a system where they can drop off their ballots in these ballot boxes across the metropolitan area. And so he was like, I'm going to actually vote in person because I don't want my ballot to get burned in this ballot box.
Wow.
And I thought, oh, well, here's maybe my in. I can talk to him about democracy. And so I said to him, look, the one thing I know to be true about Kamala is if you vote for her and you're not pleased with how she's governing, you can vote her out in 4 years. I don't know that we can say the same thing about Trump. Like, if you vote for him and you don't like the way he's governing, he may stay there. And this man looked me in the eye and said to me, if it's working, that's okay. Anyway, I know that's an anecdote.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's so, I kind of like, I have written about this debate in the Democratic Party about, and as I pointed out, is not unique to the Democratic Party. Pretty much every party around the world that has run against a would-be strongman or authoritarian has divided over this question of, do you run on the normal concerns of politics, or do you run on the authoritarianism? Do you run on the price of eggs, or do you run on democracy? And most parties have made the same judgment that the leadership of the Democratic Party has made, which is that they'd rather run on Medicaid and tax cuts and inflation than they would about Humvees in the streets in DC and maybe Chicago, and that is embodied in the reflex. I mean, the reflex of Schumer and Jeffries every time Trump does something scary in that way. Their first reflex is to say he's trying to distract you from something else, from the Medicaid cuts, from the Epstein files, from inflation. I think that is I think that's an incredible mistake to use that word, because it is signaling to the public you don't think this stuff is that important. And I think that, there is a very logical division of responsibility here. I mean, if you're running in Iowa 2 or Pennsylvania 7, it is not your job to convince voters that Trump is an aspiring authoritarian. Your job is to convince him that he hasn't done enough for your bottom line. If you are the national leadership of the party, it is, however, your job to make this harder for him than it has been, because it really hasn't been that hard. I mean, if you look at what he has been able to do from January until now in terms of shifting, loosening, uprooting the basic pillars of civil liberties and democracy, man, he's made a lot of progress without a lot of pushback from anywhere. Universities, business groups. Imagine if Joe Biden said we're going to take 10% of Intel, what would we be seeing? So, no one, Tim Snyder didn't really follow his own advice because he moved to Canada, but the advice in his book is pretty good on tyranny, like make them fight for every inch. And no one would say Schumer and Jeffries is doing that, I think. And so I feel that both things are true. Like the average candidate in 26 is obviously going to run on the price of eggs, not on democracy. But does the Democratic national leadership have to do more of what Newsom and Pritzker are doing, and basically saying, hey, people, this is not normal. What's happening is not normal, and you should be worried about it. I think one reason people aren't more worried about it is because none of people are telling them that what they're seeing. If you go out there and say it is a distraction, you are basically saying it's not that big a deal that he's sending troops into cities. That's and right. I just think that is just off from a political strategy point of view, but even more from a substantive point of view. Like this, Trump, if nothing else, Trump is a student of human weakness. And when he sees vulnerability, he keeps marching. And that's certainly been the case with the Republicans in Congress. I think it's the case with the Supreme Court. I think John Roberts has very clearly shown him he does not want to have a big fight. And so he keeps pushing the envelope. And I think he feels the same way about the way Democrats are responding to his challenges to democracy, in particular the use of troops to either effectuate mass deportation or to fight crime. He's looking at it, they're afraid to fight me, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, he did back down just a touch from J.B. Pritzker.
Yeah,
I mean, when that guy said, who's fighting him and who has billions behind him to do it if he needs, I mean, that's a white guy with billions of dollars and the moxie to go right up against Trump. Yeah. And I think that made a difference.
Can I ask, since I've answered, let me do my normal role, ask a question. Tory, you're sitting there thinking, okay, like the point of view of the leadership is that like any hour we're not talking about Medicaid and tax cuts, we're shifting the focus to somewhere Trump would prefer it. Versus the point of view that says you can't really let him do this stuff without more of a pushback. Where do you come out on that?
Both. I think you have to. I really think that Democrats, especially leadership in DC, especially, there's the away teams in your governors and your mayors that should be explaining things too, but especially the leadership that gets like the brand Democrat. Mm-hmm. They have to contextualize what's happening, that this is unconstitutional overreaches, and he's doing it because he wants to keep up his grift. He is stealing from you in these ways. And, and meanwhile, you've lost your health insurance or you've been kicked off a food stamp. Like, I mean, I was with I know I'm the queen of anecdotes, but like I was with my mom who had in January, and we were in a hospital in San Antonio, Texas, and hospitals all have CNN playing everywhere, or this particular one did. And I mean, I could tell you like elderly and infirm were saying, just tell the people why you stand for this and they'll believe you. Like my mom was begging for Democrats to just explain why they stand for what they stand for, and people will follow, just explain it a little bit more. So anyway, I think it's a both and punch. I think we have to punch on the democracy front, but we need to explain it. And I think Gavin's been doing very well at this, like that Trump doesn't want a referendum on his economy.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. I tell you what, I think that is a great place to stop. I know that Ron has deadlines to meet, and this has been
deadlines and commitments, as Bob Seger said.
That's right. And your editors are texting me right now saying, get
hell?
Ron back to the keys.
What the hell? Yeah. Exactly.
All right. Thank you so much, Ron Brownstein. We knew this would be a treat. You're one of the greats. I think Tori and I were both tickled, and unfortunately Jen couldn't join us. So that was a little bit sad, but
well, thanks for having me.
No, thanks for coming.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. And I just want to remind our listeners to recruit and review, give us 5 stars, tell a friend, keep coming back. And with that, we will see you next Thursday. Until then, do good, be well, hug your loved ones, and tell your dog I say hi.
Thank you.